the Asian Pacific, it's Saturday morning, May 1st, I believe. So good day to all of our friends in Australia, and Magandang Umage to our Philippine friends.
Thank you, Tom.
I'm learning. So at this time, I want to ask you to mute your microphones.
Yep.
And if you have any questions, you can send it to us by chat anytime during the program. And then at the end of the program, Paul and I will be available to answer questions, enter into a discussion, and we can take as much time as we need to interact with you. The program today is The Love of Stones. It's being brought to you by the Viewing Stone Association of North America, VSANA, which is an online educational center established in 2012 to help people learn about the ancient Asian art of stone appreciation. We reach people through our website, through magazine articles, books, videos, and now we will have a 45-minute to an hour-long seminar every 4 to 6 weeks. Most of you know who I am, and it's a pleasure to welcome a special guest tonight, Paul A. Harris, who's Professor Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles. Paul writes and lectures about stones and is a real stone connoisseur, but from a different viewpoint than most of us. He's the creator of the Petroverse of Pierre Jardin, but I'll tell you more about that later and give you a link to his website. Now, we're going to be talking about what is viewing stone appreciation and why do people get so excited about certain rocks? Why do people love a rock? And I have here one Japanese stone on the right and a Chinese Taihu stone, red Taihu stone on the left. And I see people get very excited about this. And we're going to be exploring today why this is so. Well, humans have used stones in many utilitarian ways throughout recorded history. They've used them to build bridges, roads, tools, weapons, monuments, tombstones, markers. But in the last 2,000 to 4,000 years, they started collecting stones for their aesthetic qualities and appreciating them. And so what we will do is to talk about this. Paul will present his part of the program. Then I will come back on the program and talk about some of the stones that I love. So let's get underway. And I'm going to turn the program over to Paul, who's going to pick up on this as soon as I cut loose. Okay. So we'll give Paul a second to.
Yeah, sorry, I'm scrambling to get my tech in order. And first, just thank you to Tom Elias for his deep love of stone and for propagating and sharing that love of stone. I've taken huge inspiration from meeting Tom and learned so much from him. I've learned about history, I've learned about geology, I've learned how to look at stones. So it's really a pleasure to do this, and I'm honored to be asked to do it with Tom. My love of stone comes from, I call it love of stone or stones, material, the geologic as such, as well as individual rocks. And I do think of this first in an evolutionary perspective. Humans and Homo sapiens and earlier ancestors of Homo sapiens have such a deep connection to walking the landscape and looking at individual rocks and thinking about what they look like and what one could do with them. So this first slide is of two my metalliths, two figure-like stones, but they are from almost 500,000 years ago. And so they precede modern humans. They've been dated this way. And so we know from this that what we do when we walk the landscape looking for interesting stones or looking at mountains, looking at rock forms, that humans have learned and been shaped by this deep connection to stone. So whenever I'm out in a landscape looking at rocks, I do think about what an archaic act it is to walk the landscape, think about the beauty of stones, think about picking them up. Forwarding very quickly to, there's such a history of artists who have had this experience of being shaped by looking at stones. So Henry Moore, the 20th century British sculptor, who no doubt many of you can imagine sculptures of, and I'll show a couple in a minute. You know, very early in his career, he was making drawings of pebbles. And these drawings of pebbles were ideas for sculptures. And he spoke, I won't read this passage verbatim, but he spoke of how he went to the beach each year and he saw new forms of pebbles. It's like he learned from walking and looking at small stones to think about form and the human figure. He then talked about how different it is if he sits down at the beach and he picks up handfuls of stones one by one, and that by doing that, it changed the way that he looked at forms and looked at stones. So I took these simple photographs of a day sitting on the beach in Southern California, looking at stones, and I just recommend this for anyone who has not done this. When you're walking the beach, looking at pebbles from above, you see interesting things, but you find many more interesting things and much more variety if you actually stop and sit down and immerse yourself in it. So we can see from Henry Moore's sculptures through the years, this is now 45 years later, that he's continually thinking about these pebble forms. And it was a wonderful day when I found this beautiful, tiny, tiny beach pebble, which is very hard to actually photograph. This is, you know, just a 1.5 inch, say 10 centimeters wide pebble. But you can see just in this form so much of what Henry Moore's sculptures look like, including a hole that goes through the pebble with this tiny one embedded. And it looks very much like this piece that Henry Moore did, 4-piece composition, reclining figure, this kind of curve, a tiny piece of stone that we see in this, same kind of form. And I use this as an occasion to also talk about my own love of stone, all the ways in which I work with rocks. I research rocks in a scholarly way. I collect rocks. I make a rock garden. I also, as an artist, install rocks in exhibitions. I collaborate with other artists, including Richard Turner, who's here tonight. But I think of all this work as playing rocks. Playing rocks is the joy and the feeling, and with that comes humor. So when I thought about how to display this little pebble, and then I saw this reclining figure, this lying down person, I decided that I would try to make a reclining figure display of this stone. So this is a book cover by Thich Nhat Hanh, a wonderful monk who writes about mindfulness and relaxation in this book. And the more relaxed reclining figure from the 4-piece composition reclining figure is relaxing in a hammock. So I show this not in the high art of viewing stone collecting, but in the joy of thinking about displaying stones and playing with stones in many different ways. So when I think about individual stones, I always think about the relationship of every rock to Earth. We call the Earth the third planet, the third rock, from the sun. Every rock is a miniature Earth. So some years ago, I found this chip of rock that looks like the top of this larger boulder in the Uha Desert. And I thought, oh, this rock, in English, we would say a chip off the old block, a piece of its parent. And it just came to me how every rock is a memory of the Earth. Every rock is a memory chip, as we say in computing. A rock is a memory chip off the old block of the Earth. And so if I were to make a model of the Earth, this wooden stand used to hold a globe, a map of the planet. But if we think in terms of stones being models of Earth, and we think of rocks preceding human existence, this would be a more accurate globe of the Earth, this beautiful bicolor green, heavy, dense stone from a river on the Northern California coast. The mystical writer, a Scottish-born artist who lived on the south coast of England in the 20th century, Ithell Colquhoun. She was a surrealist painter. She was an occultist. She was interested in dreams and imagery, but she had a deep connection to stones, and she wrote a book about living with the stones of southern England as a kind of memoir of the land. And she says that the life of any region on Earth depends ultimately on its geology, that the rocks of a place determine the character of the rivers, it shapes the plants and animals that live there, and even the type of human being who lives there. So this is a very deep way of thinking of humans as shaped by stone. So often we think of humans in terms of life and the evolution of creatures. We think of humans as descending from monkeys, but ultimately we are geologic creatures of the Earth and deeply connected to stone. Colquhoun was a mystic, and she believed that the structure of rocks shape what she called the psychic land of the Earth. She felt that the stones and rock formations of a place each have their own personality, and depending on how they were formed and when they were formed, they create a manifestation of what she calls the Earth's spirit. So remember that she's writing this before modern geology, before tectonic plate theory, but she has a deep, deep feeling about the processes of geologic formation and how much they mark the relationships that we have to a place. Thinking of mountains and stones as sacred spirits is universal. It's found across the world and through so many different cultures. It's found in indigenous North American, Native American cultures. If you think of South America and Machu Picchu and the deep relationships that Incas have to stone, you can think of all the different cave art and formations in Western Europe. And of course, as a scholar and someone who has collaborated with a philosopher friend who's an expert in Taoism, Robin Wong, I always think, of course, of the Chinese tradition of such a deep connection to stone as sacred spirit, as in the sacred mountains. Also, individual rocks that are extremely famous, that carry with them a great feeling of earth forces. So I'm sorry to use the English translation for the name of this stone and the English translation of the garden in Suzhou, the lingering garden as we call it. This stone, I think, I would guess, is the most photographed and known individual rock in the world. I would just guess this. A much admired stone with an amazing history of how it came to be in that garden, which takes more time than we have to tell. But clearly a deep, deep attachment to rocks and mountains as conveyors of earth energy and spirit. And then I just use this very familiar image to most of you, I'm sure, of Mifu paying homage to a stone and greeting it as his elder. And I put this in here also because Tom will be speaking of Mifu and Chinese stone appreciation later. So this is really just a very simple evocation of this tradition, but as an example of things that we find across the world. My own relationship to stone, my love of stone, I think of as absorbing stone or stones. When we think of absorbing stone, this is a different way of feeling stone than when I think of viewing stones, I think of viewing and looking at stone. But absorbing stone is also tactile and very much something you feel in the body. So absorbing in English, of course, means something that attracts our attention. I am absorbed by a beautiful painting. I am absorbed by a beautiful rock. I can look at something for a long time. But absorbing is also a physical process. It's the feeling and the experience of exchanging material. So a sponge absorbs water. So absorbing stone is the feeling of receiving and taking in stone in your body, a feeling of physical connection as well as a visual or aesthetic connection to stone. I think about absorbing stone with the attachment I have to certain individual stones. So this I just have called ancient rivers. This is from a river in Colorado. Daryl Whitley, who's here tonight, I have to thank for my finding this stone. It happened on the first time that he took me to this river. I feel very, very grateful for that. This stone display is not a good display. Of course, the stone is much too big for the suiban. This stone is very long, but it has such a wonderfully deep, peaceful smoothness, just a slight rise in the landscape. You get a little bit of landscape feeling. It has an interesting, different rough texture. Viewed from this end, it resembles a catfish, if you know what that looks like in English. And as a material, this stone is ancient. This stone is amphibolite. So it was formed under tremendous heat and pressure, probably about 2.3 billion years ago. So probably about half the age of the Earth. And it would have been formed when the landscape of Colorado, where it is now, was a chain of volcanic formations pulling apart tectonic plates at the edge of the North American continental plate. So this stone would have formed at a depth of 20, 30, or 40 kilometers at least. It's an ancient, ancient material, and it has striations of feldspar that have been embedded in it under tremendous pressure. But I feel such a deep peace in this stone. I have it next to me right now. I keep it next to me on my desk. I keep my hand on this stone a lot of the time when I'm reading and working and thinking. This stone may evoke for some of you similarities to suiseki, to Japanese river stones. And of course, that's no accident, because the volcanic islands that we now call Japan are very similar to what the volcanic islands of Colorado were at this time in Earth history. So this is a stone that absorbs me, that I feel I absorb the spirit of as well. When I think about the spirit of the land, what Ithel Cahoon was talking about, how we feel the spirit of a land in the landscape, I think about my local place of collecting stones in Southern California. So south of Los Angeles, there's a peninsula called Palos Verdes, and geologically it has a very complex history because 3 tectonic plates interacted, subducted under one another, uplifted land, and folded things. So in the cliff above the beach where I collect stones, you get this amazing visible recumbent fold, as it's called. And in the rocks on the beach below, I have found stones where you have similar lineation patterns. So these are just rocks. These are not viewing stones with remarkable form. But when I hold these stones in my hand, I have a deep connection to the earth forces and history, the earth spirit that is in this landscape. And I always think of a famous, oft quoted sentence from the stone catalog of Cloud Forest, probably one of the earliest stone books ever written, from China in the 12th century. In English, this line is translated, "Within the size of a fist can be assembled the beauty of 1,000 cliffs." So I literally feel this when I'm holding these stones. And it's not only the beauty of 1,000 cliffs, of course, it's the earth energy that formed these cliffs that's concentrated in the rocks. So I think of this when I think about the rocks that I pick up at the beach. I call this the rock recycle. This is, again, not a remarkable stone by viewing stone standards, but I really love this rock. And it's because it embodies the forces that formed that landscape. So a geologist friend who's written a wonderful book about Southern California geology, I showed him a picture of this stone and he said, "Oh yes, this is what you get when you have deposition of subducted tectonic plates going under, then uplifted, then eroded and worn down, and then re-cemented rock pieces." So I love this stone because it has the layers, the strata of different levels of sea rise, but it also has the material that's been folded into it. The final example of a rock I want to show that embodies forces of the earth is from the Utah Desert in Southern California. This is a ventifact, so it's been shaped by wind and rain. It's been smoothed down. It's a very fragile piece of sandstone. It is not a high quality viewing stone because the material is so fragile, but it's a remarkable kind of dragon form. And when I look at this, I can feel the years and centuries and thousands of years and millions of years that wind and rain and sand would have formed this. And it evokes for me, because of its dragon form, the famous dragons of Taoism as an embodiment of earth forces, of qi, of the dragon breathing force of the universe, and depicted in this beautiful scroll by Chen Rong from the 13th century. And these forces that we see going through here that are embodied in the dragon and continuous with it are characteristic of the forces of nature and the energy of nature that forms these things. So when I'm looking at this rock, these are the things that I'm thinking of. And with that, we'll transition back to Tom as a transition to stone appreciation in different traditions.
Okay, I'll be with you in just a second. Okay, here we are. Now it's my turn to talk to you about some of the stones I love and why. These two different types of stones are some of the oldest that have been appreciated since people began collecting them. The small stones on your left are called Nanjing rainflower pebbles. They came out of an ancient gravel pit formed by the Yangtze River as it turned. And these were shaped and formed by the gravel and the water flowing over it. And the rainflower pebbles have been found in ancient burial sites in Nanjing that are 3,000 and 4,000 years old. So it's evidence that these served, the beauty of these served in some form of aesthetic function. On the right, the small Ling Bi stone would be the kind of stone you would find on a scholar's studio on his desk. It may have a paintbrush or a brush rest. And some of the earliest stones are known as brush rests. They served a utilitarian function as well as a very practical or aesthetically beautiful. Now, thousands of people flocked to Tokyo in early February for the annual Japan Suiseki exhibit, except for this year. They still held the exhibit, but fewer people. And it's one of the finest exhibitions worldwide of viewing stones from mainly Japan, but many foreign collectors also display at this. And in Italy, the Italian Association of Suiseki lovers put on a wonderful exhibition each year in different cities throughout Italy. It's a first-class exhibit. And if we look, we're seeing that throughout the world, exhibitions are being held. South America, Indonesia, Germany, Spain, Australia, Vietnam, Philippines. So something about stones are fascinating people. They really love stones, and we're looking at why that is the case. So what makes a good stone? What are the features of a good stone? Well, Mi Fu, who was a stone connoisseur in the Song dynasty, loved stones, and he developed a rhyming 4-character set: Shou, Lo, To, and So, one of the earliest criteria for evaluating stones. Now, the stones that he was admiring were primarily Ling Bi stones and Taihu stones and Ying stones, which are illustrated here. The ones that had the channels, holes in them, thinness. Later, the other criteria for evaluating stones, stones that looked old or aged, antiquity. And then eventually, the most widely accepted criteria for evaluating stone became the shape and form, color, the composition, the material it's made of, texture, and age. And this is probably the most widely used set of criteria for evaluating stones. And then the overall impression, the impression when you look at it and absorb it, what does it leave you with? And this is a very important aspect. But it's really more than just those evaluation criteria. It's the experience and awakening, awareness. When you go out and find a great stone in nature, it's exciting. If you're hunting in the excitement of finding an old stone with provenance, who owned this and who owned it before them? Or knowing that an important collector once owned the stone that you now have. Seeing a stone in an important exhibition. The association with literature, arts. It creates feelings of contemplation, meditation, happiness, joy. Many different types of emotions come with admiring and appreciating stones. Now I'm going to look at a few traditional and contemporary stones that I love. This is a relatively small Gobi Desert stone, and you can see how it's been put down in layers over thousands of years. The base was made, I had the base made for this, and I wanted it to reflect those layers so that it forms a one unit, a harmonious unit between the base and the stone. Now, this is one of my favorite stones. It's called Clouds Coming and Going, because the calcite or quartz mineral on this stone resembles clouds moving around the peaks. This is a Furia stone from Wakayama, Japan. It was collected in the late 1960s, and it belonged to Suzuki Koji. Mr. Suzuki was a wonderful base carver, and this was one of the first bases that he made when he was quite young. And he turned professional and made bases for over 40 years, and he kept this stone in his house. And Hiromi and I would visit his home, and we would sit on tatami mats and talk about his collection, looking at his stones and talking about the role of bases or dies. And I admired this stone. And he told me that a very prominent businessman, a dealer, came to his house several times and wanted to buy this stone, but he wouldn't sell it to him. And he said, I wouldn't sell it to him because all he wants to do is turn around and sell it to someone else and make a profit off of it. And so on our last visit to him in February 2014, he said he offered it to me. He said that he told me he wanted the stone to go to somebody who would appreciate it, value it, protect it, write about it. And he didn't want it to go just as a business transaction. So he entrusted this stone to me. It was a very special stone for him because this was one of his early bases. And I was flattered. And Mr. Suzuki died not too long after that. So now I'm caring for this stone. And sometime in the future, I will look for someone to take care of it. I'll pass it on to someone else who will appreciate it as much as Mr. Suzuki and I did. Now, this is another stone I love. I have many stones that I love, and there are multiple reasons for this. This stone is a little bit bigger than your fist of your hand. It has a raw beauty to it. It's a Japanese chrysanthemum flower stone, a natural one from Neo Valley. And geologists tell me that this stone formed about 250 million years ago. Now, can you imagine what the Earth looked like 250 million years ago? North America didn't exist as a continent. It was just one big continent, Pangea, at that time. And not long after that, it began to break up and the tectonic plates were floating on the surface. This flower-like mineral, or this chrysanthemum flower stone, existed before the main period of the dinosaurs. It was here before T-Rex and his reptilian friends, cousins, were roaming the earth. It's truly remarkable that this stone has been around that long. Now, this stone came from Neo Valley in Japan, high up above Gifu. And it was first owned by Dr. Shiraki, a doctor who bought Round Mountain, where the chrysanthemum stones come from. And he sent some of the chrysanthemum stones to the imperial household, to the emperor's family. And because the imperial crest was a 16-flowered chrysanthemum flower, 16-petaled chrysanthemum flower. And Dr. Shiraki helped popularize chrysanthemum stones in Japan. He even had a chrysanthemum stone museum in Gifu, where this stone may have been exhibited. And later, this stone was passed on to Mr. Kasahara, a Japanese stone connoisseur and widely respected dealer, and he held it. And then eventually, 11 years ago, it passed to Hiromi and me. So now we have an important piece of geological history, as well as an important stone in the history of Japanese stone appreciation. This stone is another favorite of mine, and I like it because it has 5 arches in it. Reminds me of seacoast. And I had the base carved so it would emphasize those arches. And so when you look at it, the arches stand out. It's a small Ligurian stone from Italy, northwestern Italy. And this stone I can look at as it's turning and appreciate from any viewpoint. Another stone I have that I enjoy very much is this stone from Southern California. It's a piece of petrified wood, but it's not wood at all because all the organic material has been replaced with minerals. So it's completely petrified. And it might have been a sycamore tree, because 20,000 years ago in Southern California, there were many lakes in the desert, and there were sycamore and willow trees, alders. California was totally different 20,000 years ago than it is today. Now, this stone is from the Miocene. It's only 5 million to 23 million years old. So it's a baby, an infant among the age of stones. The chrysanthemum flower stone I showed you is maybe 20 or 40 times older. When I see this stone, I think of the American West. I think of the indigenous people that lived here, the Indians, long before the European settlers arrived. So the American Indians lived in harmony with nature, respected the earth, the plants, animals. And I like to display this stone with an authentic Native American drum that reinforces my association of the stone with Western North America. This stone and drum stirs a lot of emotion in me when I view it. Then this Chinese Lingbi stone. I call this stone Gateway to Heaven. And this stone helps me learn about aspects of the Chinese culture, particularly Taoism, a philosophy developed into a religion. And in Taoism, there's a concept of gateways to heaven. There are 10 major gateways and 36 minor. And so there actually is a place in Eastern China, you go high up into the mountains and you can see a large area, and part of the stone has dropped out and you can climb up to that. And in the Taoist religion, you thought that you could enter heaven through one of these gateways. And so this stone helps me learn about Chinese culture. Now, here are 2 stones that more recent. They don't have a long history like the ones I've been showing you. The one on the left is from the Philippines, and it was a gift to me from Felicidad Gupti, Philly, as she's known to her friends. In see, I think it was 2015 that I acquired this stone, actually both stones. And Phili Gupti was the founder of the Natural Stone Society of the Philippines. And this is the 20th anniversary of that society. It was founded in 2001, in April 2001. So we're still in April in California. So it has a lot of meaning to it, this figure stone. It reminds me of the struggle of many Filipinos. The stone on the right is a river cobble, and it tells me about the geological history of the Philippines. It's not a quiet, peaceful stone. It shouts at you. The shell formations in this river cobble are bright, and it tells me that the geological history of the Philippines was not a quiet, peaceful development, but a very violent experience in formation with shells and minerals and things coming together, being squeezed and pushed and heated to form this stone. So these two stones are very special to me because they came from the Philippines and they have a lot of meaning. They communicate to me. As Paul said, I absorbed this. You view a stone, you absorb what you see, and then that leads to appreciation. As I said before, it's more than just those physical characters, the shape, the form. It's the experience, the awakening. And I think that anyone who has seriously collects stones can understand this. When you find something important and bring it home and see it, it becomes more than just a rock or a stone. Now, I'm going to pause here and we're going to open up for questions and discussions. And Paul and I will be happy to answer any questions you have. There's been several questions that come in through the chat box, which we can look at. But if you want to, you can welcome to ask any of us a question or make a comment. So unmute your microphones so that you can talk to us, and let's see if there's any comments that you may have or questions at this point.
And Tom, I'll tell you a question very specific from